next thing I'm going to do is spray the surface of the paper with a good amount of water to get the surface nice and damp. And I want to kill most of that white with some colour. So I'm coming in here with a huge brush, as you can see, and I'm using the interactive acrylics. And this is simply a mix of cadmium yellow and a little bit of titanium white. And I've just put that on, in a very simple way. But that's going to cover most of our white paper, if not all of it. And then having done that, I'm going to keep the surface of the painting nice and damp, stop the paint drying out. I'm adding just a little bit of phthalo blue to that mixture, and I'm just going to add little bits of that colour into the still damp paint and let the water and the paint mix in their own way. And hopefully that's going to create some nice random effects for us. And we'll perhaps put a little bit more paint on the lower half of the painting, where we've got grass. So even in this simple way, we've just distinguished between the grass area and the foliage of the background. Now, having done that, the painting's obviously still wet, and if I want to, I can kind of lift off a little bit of the colour just with a scrunched up paper towel. And that just introduces a nice little bit of texture to the background. And while we're at it, what we may as well do, this probably won't lift off all the paint, but I'm going to take a clean paper towel which I've just sprayed with water, and because it's the interactive acrylic, I can lift off, actually that's doing a pretty good job, isn't it? I can lift off quite a lot of that first layer of paint I've done, so that I don't really need yellow and green horses to paint over. Much easier to work on the plain paper. So very quickly we've introduced a colourful and texture-filled background. Next up, I need to block in the horses. So I've mixed up a chestnut brown using a combination of permanent alizarine, cadmium yellow deep, and phthalo blue. And as you just saw, I've just sprayed the surface of the painting just to get the paint flowing a little bit more fluidly. Now, I don't want the paper to be soaking wet here because I don't want too many runs, but it just makes life easier than painting onto a completely dry surface. So what I'm doing initially, as you can see, is just blocking in the adult horse in the background. Well, not in the background, but behind the foal. And I want the focus of this painting to be the young horse. So my plan is to have a slightly enhanced level of contrast and detail on the foal compared to the adult horse that we're working on at the moment. So I'm just going to finish blocking in the adult. Having finished blocking in the adult with that initial colour, I'm now going to spray the surface of the painting just in the area of the foal with water. And I'm going to come back in now with the same brown, but I've added some extra cadmium yellow deep and some extra permanent alizarin to the mixture. So what I've effectively done by doing that is reduced the amount of blue that I've got in my brown. And what we'll do now is block in the foal, but in this case I'm going to be a little bit more careful with my brush strokes, try to be a little bit more expressive. just keep in mind the contours of the animal that I'm painting. Now I am keeping an eye on whether the line work I've done previously needs correction as I work around the painting, but so far things have looked reasonably okay, which is, well, actually there's something I can improve. I can improve the line of the belly there. So there's the little foal blocked in. And while that paint is still wet, I've just added some titanium white to the same mixture, and I can use that now, once again working my way around the foal, just to begin to introduce some subtle highlights. So all I'm doing is looking at my reference and picking out the areas where the light is catching. Now, these particular horses, they're not just sort of one colour really, they have quite a variation in colour, and the darker areas of their skin is, well, it's almost a deep purpley blue, so we'll be adding that in just a little bit. But just for now, I want to just add a few highlights of more or less the same colour that I was using before. So I'm going to go ahead and do that for the foal and for the larger horse behind her. Alright, so having blocked in both horses and added some subtle highlights, I've now mixed up a combination of phthalo blue, the permanent alizarine, and that gave me a nice dark purple, and then I added just a touch of cadmium yellow deep, and I'm going to use this as the base colour for the tails, the mane, and the shadow areas on the rest of the horses as well. So we'll change some of these colours a bit as we move around the painting, but the main thing is really just to get both of the horses covered with paint so that we can kind of see what to do next. Now as I'm painting the mane or the tail, I'm keeping the direction of my brush strokes in mind. So for example here I'm going up because I'm getting that nice frayed edge as I lift the brush off the paper. So similarly with the tail, I'm applying the paint in the direction in which the hair is falling. And we want to keep the surface of our painting reasonably damp so that when we lift the brush off, we get a nice fluid and hopefully a little bit of a frayed end to the brush stroke. Now, when we come to paint things like the mane or the tail, the temptation is to start to paint hair. And ideally you want to avoid doing that. A better approach is to just treat it as a lump or a mass of tone. And then what we'll do later is add a few selective strands of hair. And hopefully that will be more effective and certainly more efficient than trying to portray individual hairs. Now, some of that same colour, with a little bit of white mixed in, we can use to just lift out a few subtle highlights without getting too bogged down with details. And that same colour is actually going to be useful for the lower parts of the legs. So generally speaking, when we paint the legs of an animal, it's a useful technique to apply the paint with a brush stroke which kind of wraps around the leg. It helps to create the illusion of 3 dimensions. But again, we're trying to avoid getting wrapped up in any detail. We're keeping the shapes nice and simple and just thinking about the general form, excuse me, the general form of what we're painting. So I'm going to go ahead and continue the same treatment to the legs of the main horse, and I'll probably also add a bit of shadow on the head here. Next we're going to start doing some further modelling on both horses. So I've mixed up more of a purpley reddish brown this time. In fact, it's almost completely purple, to be honest with you. Now that first application of paint went on far more heavily than I wanted, so I'm going to come back to that in just a moment. And having sprayed the surface of the painting with water again, what I'm going to do is actually just start on the adult horse, and we'll see how it goes up here. So that's working reasonably well. Now, because I'm using the interactives, when I spray the dry paint, some of that will mix in with what I'm applying now, which is no bad thing in this particular case. Let's just improve that line a little bit there. So what we can do as we move around the painting is, if there's a region of deep shadow, I can put this colour on really quite thickly. But if I want to mix in with the underlying colour for a more subtle shading, then I can spray the painting with water and just very lightly apply the new colour to get a little bit of colour mixing going on. And again, even at this stage, we want to avoid getting lured into too much detail work. because we can always add the details reasonably quickly towards the end of the painting. You see, I've been able to lift off that rather heavy application of paint that I put on just a little while ago. So the tonal work's coming together reasonably well there. And while that's just drying a little bit, I'm going to use that same colour applied very lightly to introduce some cast shadow below and around both horses. I've allowed that paint to pretty much dry. It's certainly touch dry, apart from a few areas. And what we're going to do now is add some highlights here and there. So just coming in with a mixture of the phthalo blue and white. And just popping a few highlights in. Now sometimes we may want quite a hard edged highlight. That can be quite an effective way to work. So for example, if I do that, that's reasonably hard edged. So is that. And I can introduce a few of those on the mane. So just suggests the light is catching certain areas. But for example, if I wanted a softer edged highlight, I can spray with the water and drag my brush through, and that can work equally well in colour, but it does reflect what's going on in my reference, and it adds a nice little bit of variation rather than just having exactly the same coloured highlight all the way across the painting. It's good to have a bit of variety. So this is the same mix as the highlight on here, but just a bit more white added. And in fact, I'll use some of that over here as well. Now things are looking a little bit dour and sinister at the moment, and that's because I've mostly been working from dark to light. So now hopefully we're going to bring a little bit of life into the painting by adding some of the paler colours which are present on these horses. So this is a mix of titanium white, cad yellow deep, and a little bit of the sort of chestnut brown that I'd mixed up earlier. So coming in for a slightly closer look now, we need to just pick out some detail on the eyes. So you can see I've switched from the flat brush I've been using for most of this painting to a small round brush. And I'm using a pale blue here to pick out the upper and lower lids. And while I've got that colour on the brush, I'll just put in a couple of more controlled highlights. I've gone through some of the pale, still wet, pale brown there, but that's okay. I can make use of that little accident there. And while I've got that colour on the brush, I'll just pick out the edges of the ears here and there, just to make them stand out a little more against the other horse. Now I've gone back to my flat brush momentarily just to add some paler colour in the centres of the ears of the little foal there. I'll use that same colour, just the corner of the brush on the upper lids. Then I just need to add some very dark colour to the eyes and the nostrils. Now, unusually in this painting I haven't used any burnt umber at all up until now, but this is a mix of burnt umber and phthalo blue. So we're just going to use that to make things a little darker in the eyes. And I don't know that we need much for the nostrils actually, but I'll add a couple of licks. And then just a pale blue highlight. In each eye. So we're getting close to completion now. But what I want to do is have a little bit of fun with some of the marker outlines that I've still got visible. So I'm just more or less going to pick some colours that I think will work regardless of what's going on in my reference. So for example, this is kind of a pale yellow orange, and I'm just covering up in certain areas some of those outlines, or even adding a little outline where the original pen line isn't visible. So this is some of the alizarine just mixed in with a bit of white. And yeah, I'm not going to go overboard with this, but it's just a few licks of colour here and there. That's perhaps a little bit much. Oh, I don't know, that's not too bad. We'll pop a little bit there as well. And then for the horses, I think I'm pretty much done, but I think I want to just work. I'm happy with the upper background. I like the lightness and the watercolour nature of that. I mean, it's acrylic, but you know, the wet in wet effect. But I feel perhaps I need to do a little bit more. I need to soften this line here, and then, well, we'll see what it looks like when I've done that. So here's a bit of a close-up look at different parts of the painting. So hopefully you can get a nice look at the brushwork and the textures and colours that I've used. You can see the highlights in the main there. Now these dark lines in the background, although I just said previously that I quite like those, I think I'm going to soften those and make them more of a bluey green, maybe a bit of yellow. I'll show you the finished version in just a second. You can see I've softened that horizon line, and here that's a really nice look at the legs of the foal and the kind of cylindrical brush marks that I mentioned earlier. So here's the finished pick full scale, and that's the complete painting. So you can see I've softened the background now. But I think I actually, although I quite like the background, I think I've actually prefer this cropped version. So that's pretty much this painting of a horse and foal done, this demo complete. Thanks very much for watching. Please remember to subscribe, and I hope to see you next Sunday for the next episode of the Sunday Art Show. Thanks again for watching.